Now, if you're like me, who grew up in the late 90s and early 2000s, and were, like me, into nerdy stuff such as fantasy, sci-fi and video games, sheesh, remember when it was considered nerdy to like video games? Oh boy, how times have changed. Then per maybe you might have stumbled across a game series called The Battle for Middle-earth. The first one being released in 2004 and was an absolute blast to play, that followed the journey of the Fellowship as the good campaign, and the non-canon evil campaign where you control Isengard and later Mordor in an alternate version of the events that unfolded during the War of the Ring. And in early 2006, EA released Battle for Middle-earth 2, which followed the same premise of good and evil campaign, but without the filler missions in between the big story events. However, in late 2006, they dropped an expansion that would shake the very foundation of the world. At least for me it did. This one differed from the other two, as it did focus solely on the forces of evil's point of view, except for the epilogue mission. And this masterpiece has the very short name Battle for Middle-earth: The Rise of the Witch King, which tells the story of the fall of Arnor from our favorite Dreadlord's perspective. Now that's an expansion, and one of the motivations behind this video. Anyway, I've been rambling on too long about games from a bygone era, and it is time to get our hands down in the nitty-gritty that is this video. Ponder for a quick spell, fellow nerds and lore enthusiasts. Do you like sorcery that stems from the dark arts? Do you like spiky armor and massive weapons that no man could actually wield? Do you enjoy the finer things in life, such as the destruction of a kingdom, turning its dead into whites, and spreading terror and dread wherever you go? Speaking of terror and dread, I should play another Dirge run in Baldur's Gate. Anyway, then do I have the perfect story to tell for you, about a gentleman who did it all. So join me as we delve deep into the realm of Tolkien once more and visit one of the most awesome and badass characters, that is, the Witch King of Angmar. Little is known about Mr. King's identity, like with all of the Nazgul, but it is with a high probability that he was of Númenórean heritage. If he was a king or a sorcerer is unclear. Perhaps, if I may be so bold, he could have been both. And I'm gonna go with both because I will fanboy over this since I've been a Witch King fan since forever. And nowadays, I have him with me always. Look, there he is, right on my arm, in all his glory. However, what we do know is when Mr. Dark Lord approached him with a trade offer of, you get a legendary ring, and I get your soul for eternity. He didn't even hesitate for a second to master loot the ring. I don't even think he cared to listen after Sauron, disguised, said legendary ring. And so Mr. King, like all the other men that received the ring, prospered for a time since their lifespan extended under the corruption of the rings, until they finally crossed the threshold and became the Nazgul, or ring wraiths, with their will completely locked to Sauron. Now, the first time there ever was a sighting of a Nazgul would be in the year 2251 of the Second Age. This is also some time before Mr. King gets his famous name, and thus the greatest of the Nazgul is simply known as the Lord of the Nazgul. And he would serve as a commander for Sauron's armies during the Second Age, in which Mr. King and the other Nazgul also participated in the climactic battle of the Last Alliance. However, when Isildur cut the ring from Sauron's hand and the Dark Lord was defeated, Mr. King and company were not able to hold on to their physical presence, and they too disappeared, temporarily, from Middle-earth. A 1,000 years into the Third Age, Sauron would return, incognito mode, and set up camp on everyone's favorite hill, a Dol Guldur. And such he forwarded mail to his most trusted fellows, the Nine, that now was the time to return and begin sowing discord and despair once more in Middle-earth. Mr. King, being very hungry for vengeance against the realms in exile, Gondor and Arnor, who subsequently brought him and his master low during the last alliance. And this would prove the most opportune moment to do so against one of the kingdoms. The northern kingdom of Arnor would be Mr. King's goal, since they were by this time a kingdom in turmoil, and thus had been split into 3 warring factions: Arthedain, Cardolan and Rhudaur. And so in 1300 of the Third Age he set to work in doing his master's plan to bring down the northern kingdom altogether. He began by founding the dark domain of Angmar, adjacent to the kingdom's northern border, where from his capital of Carndum he'd waged open war against the Dunedain of Arnor. And this is where he gets his infamous name after a series of conflicts against the Dunedain, and thus they labeled their new enemy's undead sorcerer as the Witch King, Lord of Angmar. And in 1356 of the Third Age, the Witch King locked in and began his assault against the Dunedain. And he had some help from a hillman king of Rhudaur, who had pledged allegiance to him. The current ruler of Arthedain, King Argaleb I, did not take kindly to his realm being attacked, and so he did what you'd expect. He rallied his forces and marched to the Weather Hills and fortified them as best he could against the Witch King and company. However, was ultimately defeated and slain defending Weathertop in the same year. A major victory for our Mr. King right here. However, a minor setback would soon follow with Argaleb's son, Arveleg. Bear with me here, some of these names are very similar. So Arveleg struck an alliance with the other sister kingdom of Cardolan and drove back Angmar's forces. And for around 50 years they held their defenses, but in 1409 of the Third Age, the defense finally cracked and Mr. King attacked the Tower of Amon-Sul and burnt it down. During the battle, King Arveleg of Arthedain was also slain. After this victory, the Witch King wasted no time and swiftly moved into Cardolan and overran it, and in the same process annexed Rhudaur, leaving Arthedain to stand alone against this terrible force of evil. Mr. King, knowing this to be the case, seized the initiative once more and launched a full-scale invasion of Arthedain, and was very close to succeeding. However, Arafor, the current king of Arthedain, had other plans, and reached out to his elven buddies of Lindon and Rivendell, and with their combined strength of arms managed to beat back Angmar at the capital of Arthedain, Fornos Erain, and drove them into the north from whence they came. This victory brought an uneasy peace in the north, because they knew that the Lord of the Nazgul could wage war for centuries. And when in 1636 of the Third Age, when the last of the Dunedain of Cardolan died, Mr. King played his hand once more. And so he sent evil wights to the Barrow Downs, old resting places and tombs of the Dunedain, where they inhabited those tombs to prevent any form of rebirth of that kingdom. A real dick move to say the least, and one that I completely love. Some odd 300 years later, after building up his armies, the Witch King's forces would ultimately claim victory in the north when they captured Fornos Erain, where he'd been repelled all those years earlier. And with its fall, the final bastion of the northern kingdom fell into ruin. Yet hope remained, since King Arvedui managed to escape death. However, when he tried to sail via the ice bay of Foroshel, his ship sank, and with it the last remnants of Arnor. Rather pleased with himself and this ultimate victory, Mr. King took seat in the newly captured Fornos. Only one problem. Arnor's southern allies, Gondor, did not like the northern kin being destroyed, and Eanor, crown prince of Gondor, arrived the following year in the Grey Havens with an army. Too late to save Arnor, but not too late for revenge. And so he marched towards Fornost alongside the elves of Lindon and the remnants of the northern Dunedain. The battle, however, did not take place at Fornost because Mr. King, high on life and maybe a tiny bit overconfident, surely that's never had dire consequences ever, marched out of his fortified position in order to meet his adversary on the plains near Lake Evendim, near the ancient capital of Arnor, Anúminas. However, the battle is later known as the Battle of Fornost for one reason or another. I guess some historians must have really liked Fornost or disliked Anúminas. Now Mr. King lined up his forces expecting a fair and square battle. However, Eanor had a different idea and had his cavalry positioned in ambush on the north side of the battlefield, among the hills of Evendim. And when the two armies clashed, Eanor sprung his trap and his cavalry emerged on the Angmarin flank in a classic pincer maneuver. This caused the Angmarin force to give in to a little bit of a panic and ultimately was the decisive blow the Dunedain needed to win the day. The Witch King, realizing that his forces were in a bit of a pickle, attempted to flee eastward. But lo and behold, there is an army of elves emerging from the south that blocked his escape and destroyed whatever was left of his crumbling army, led by none other than Glorfindel. Mr. King's last resort was to reveal himself in person and challenge Eanor to single combat. Eanor, not being a wuss, accepted this and rode towards him. His horse, however, was not cut from the same cloth and was terrified of Mr. King's aura. And Mr. King then laughed towards Eanor. This prideful moment would not last long for our favorite dreadlord, however, as Glorfindel took up the challenge. Mr. King then turned to flight, and Eanor, having calmed his steed, set off after him. Glorfindel managed to persuade him to think otherwise with a warning that would later become prophetic in the future. "Do not pursue him. He will not return to these lands. Far off yet is his doom, and not by the hand of man shall he fall." Despite having been routed at Fornost, the Witch King had still managed to score a major victory for his master Sauron, with the utter destruction of the northern Dunedain kingdom in Eriador. And so, feeling rather pleased with himself nevertheless, I would imagine he returned to Mordor, awaiting his next order of business. Sauron at this time was still doing his shenanigans in Dol Guldur, disguised as the Necromancer. And in 1980 of the Third Age, after rallying around their master, the Nine Nazgûl re-entered Mordor in order to rebuild the master's power, and so they started to gather orc hordes about them. And in the year 2000 of the Third Age, they attacked Gondor, which had been weakened by plague and a recent Wain Rider invasion, very fast-moving horsemen from the east. The Nazgûl had their eyes on the prize, which was Minas Ithil, and after 2 years of siege, the city fell, and the Nazgûl made it their own, and after that, the city would be known as Minas Morgul, the Tower of Sorcery, and remained a not so pleasant place to visit for centuries after. About 40 years after the taking of Minas Ithil, King Eärnil II passed away, making his son, whom we've mentioned before, Eärnur, the new king of Gondor. This would prove to be advantageous for our beloved Witch King, as upon Eärnur's own coronation, he challenged the new king to single combat once more. However, Eärnur refused. Phew! Lucky that, it would be a shame for Gondor to lose their... never mind. Because 7 quick years later, the Witch King renewed his challenge, and this time Eärnur did not refuse. And so he rode out of Minas Tirith to meet his old enemy at Minas Morgul, and the gates of the now dread city opened and closed, and Eärnur was never seen again. This was a major blow to Gondor, as this ended the reign of kings, leaving it in the hands of the stewards. Not long after this, however, the Watchful Peace began in 2063, when Mr. Based Wizard Gandalf investigated Dol Guldur in search for whoever this necromancer was. Sauron then fled east, and the Nazgûl in Minas Morgul remained quiet for 400 years. And with spending roughly 400 years rolling dice and aura farming, Sauron, still under his disguised self, returned with increased strength to Dol Guldur in 2460 of the Third Age, and 15 years later, the Nazgul, who'd patiently waited, consolidating their forces in Minas Morgul, sent hordes of the newly bred Uruk-hai to attack Osgiliath, Gondor's former capital, and took control over its eastern side. Some centuries later, in 3018 of the Third Age, after Sauron had been ousted from Dol Guldur and openly declared himself in Mordor once more. And after learning from Gollum about a Baggins and a place called the Shire, the Witch King, along with 6 other wraiths, attacked Osgiliath, then proceeded to ride north into the Anduin Vale, where they found some hobbit homes. Long deserted, however. Mr. King then chose to lead his compadres to Isengard, where, per maybe, Saruman would actually prove useful and give them direction, or at least a clue, to where this Shire was. Saruman, however, had other plans, since he also coveted the One Ring, and so he simply disinclined to acquiesce to their request. This was not how it was supposed to go. But Mr. King and co. would happen on a stroke of luck when they stumbled across Grima Wormtongue in Rohan, who did not possess the same prowess as Saruman, and in fear for his life, gave Mr. King the location of the Shire. After learning this from Grima, the Nazgul went into overdrive and rode like the wind into Eriador in search for this Baggins. They came as far as Crickhollow in Buckland, where they turned the place upside down but could find naught, neither ring or bearer. Mr. King then made camp in Andrath, a point in the greenway between the Barrow Downs in the west and the South Downs in the east, where he coordinated the search for the ring, and he also stirred up some old friends of his, the good old Barrow-wites, just in case. One can never have too many peepers when looking for the One Ring. Mr. King then led 4 other wraiths with him to Weathertop, a fan favorite of his, where 1600 years earlier he'd laid it to ruin, where they discovered Frodo, Aragorn and the other hobbits. The Nazgul then sprung into action and attacked the party without proper rules of engagement, and Mr. King, like a boss, managed to stab Frodo with a Morgul knife. Though Aragorn did drive them off, Frodo's wound would be sufficient in turning him into a wraith like him. However, this would not come to pass, as the clever half-elven lord Elrond would send Glorfindel to guide Frodo to Rivendell, where he could be healed. And as they raced toward Rivendell, Glorfindel pulled a funny moment and lured the Nazgul into the river Bruinen, where Elrond, with some aesthetic flair from Gandalf, released a great flood that would destroy the wraith's physical form and kill their horses, sending Mr. King and co. back to Mordor. With the return to Mordor and their horses killed, Sauron bestowed upon his greatest servants winged beast instead. The lesser 8 Nazgul he used as reconnaissance troops, while the Witch King returned to Minas Morgul and took up his role as chief commander of Sauron's forces once more. He then launched the campaign against Gondor, marching forward with a graced host from the Morgul Vale, where at the bridge of Morgul Duin he sensed something elusive. Nah, probably nothing, and continued his march. This would be the closest the Nazgul would ever be to reclaiming the Master's Ring, and had it not been for the Phial of Galadriel that she gave to Frodo, they might as well have reclaimed it. And so on March 13, 1319 of the Third Age, the final battle for Osgiliath was fought, with Faramir and his garrison on the one side and the Witch King and his army on the other. Faramir was shortly overrun by the overwhelming force Mr. King brought with him, and so they retreated to Minas Tirith with haste. Now after this victory at Osgiliath, the paths towards total victory against his strongest enemy were within reach. And so, on the 14th, the Witch King sent out his army of orcs, Haradrim and Easterlings towards Minas Tirith, and with Sauron really wanting to win this, gave Mr. King some new buffs, where now in his presence he cast a shadow of utter paralysis and fear upon the defenders and his foes. Mr. King then began directing his army in setting the city ablaze and using siege towers instead of trying to break the impenetrable outer wall. Then came the assault on the Great Gate, where he did some sorcerer shenanigans, uttering an incantation which enhanced the power of the battering ram Grond, and weakened the gate, which Grond shortly after broke open, and the Lord of the Nazgul entered. The defenders fled before the Witch King's aura of terror, and only Gandalf would stand firm in his presence. And thus, a duel of words began between the two, and Mr. King then drew his sword, which blazed of its own accord, but Gandalf had firm, ready to battle. But then they were rudely interrupted by the horns of Rohan. And so Mr. King withdrew in order to reorganize his forces against this new threat. The Witch King mounted his winged steed in order to more efficiently coordinate his troops against this stampede of horses that rapidly was approaching. The Rohirrim then crashed into the lines of Mordor, crushing many beneath their hooves. But all good things must come to an end, and with fresh reserves joining the fray, including some Mumakils, swung the pendulum back into balance and allowing the hosts of Mordor to regroup. Witnessing the Mumakil, the Rohirrim were a bit confused, but just for a moment. However, that moment was enough for Mr. King and his flying beast to strike down Theoden King. The other Rohirrim's horses that surrounded Theoden panicked as Mr. King came down upon him. Theoden horse Snowmane also panicked, as you do when confronted with such aura, and fell on top of his master, crushing him. As the Witch King then approached his prey, two individuals stepped in his way. Eowyn, Theoden's niece, and a hobbit we know as Meriadoc Brandybuck, or Merry for short. And after some banter between Eowyn and Mr. King, Eowyn, like an absolute unit, cut the head off Mr. King's winged beast with one swing. Mr. King, not being the biggest fan of this, gave out a cry of hatred and shattered her shield and broke her left arm with a single blow of his mace. But as he towered over her, relishing in this soon-to-be triumph, he made the fatal mistake and neglected the short King Merry, who stabbed him from behind in the knee with a barrow blade. I swear there is a knee joke to be made here, but I just can't find it. One of the few weapons that could penetrate his defenses, breaking the spell, binding his undead flesh to his will. And while Mr. King was distracted, Eowyn seized this moment and rose to the occasion, and drove her sword into where the head would be, and in doing so, slaying him. And thus Glorfinder's prophecy from all those years ago at the Battle of Fornost was fulfilled, as Eowyn is in fact a woman. And this marks the end of our story regarding one of the most badass looking characters, and I thank you for listening to me rambling on about stuff that's dear to me. If you enjoyed, leave a like and comment what you like most about the Witch King, or if maybe I missed something. Fansai Guy, signing off.